The field stretched endlessly across the horizon, kissed by the golden hues of a fading summer sun. Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a place renowned for its serene beauty and tightly knit Amish communities, held a duality of peace and quiet that could suffocate an outsider. For Emily Peterson, it was both a home and a prison. Emily's modest house sat at the edge of a sprawling Amish farm owned by the Miller family. Its peeling white paint and creaky front porch seemed to echo her own exhaustion. At 35, Emily felt every bit as worn out as her surroundings. She had married Jacob Peterson, a long-haul truck driver, nearly a decade ago, full of hope for a life of love and adventure. But time had dulled the luster of their union. Jacob's constant absences, often lasting weeks, left Emily alone with nothing but the hum of cicadas and the distant rhythm of horses' hooves from the Miller farm. For years, Emily played the role of the dutiful wife. She attended church sporadically, exchanged polite smiles with her neighbors, and cultivated a garden that served more as a distraction than a passion. But loneliness had a way of creeping in like the twilight, slow but inevitable. Nights were the hardest. The emptiness of her bed mirrored the void within her, and the silence of the house often felt louder than any conversation. On the other side of the fence, the Millers thrived in their world of simplicity and faith. The patriarch, Matthew Miller, ran the farm with a firm yet kind hand, instilling values of hard work and devotion into his children. Among them was Ethan Miller, an 18-year-old who stood at the precipice of adulthood. Ethan was unlike his siblings, who seemed content with the rhythms of Amish life. There was a quiet curiosity in his eyes, a yearning to know what lay beyond the boundaries of his world. Ethan's days were filled with chores, milking cows at dawn, plowing fields under the relentless sun, and hauling bushels of corn to the barn. But his nights were different. As the stars blanketed the sky, Ethan would sit by the edge of the woods, staring toward the Petersons' house, wondering about the life of the woman who lived there. She was an enigma, a symbol of a world he'd only read about in forbidden books and heard whispered about among friends. Their first encounter was almost accidental. Emily, tending to her garden one humid afternoon, had glanced up to see Ethan guiding a team of horses across the field. Something about his demeanor, serene yet focused, drew her in. She called out a casual greeting, and he hesitated, then nodded back. That simple moment became a seed, planted in the fertile soil of two restless hearts. As weeks passed, their interactions grew. Emily began finding excuses to linger by the garden fence, waving Ethan over under the pretense of needing advice about the weather or farming techniques. Ethan, drawn to her in ways he didn't fully understand, began seeking her out too, using errands as an excuse to pass by her house. There was nothing overtly wrong in their conversations at first, just two lonely souls sharing fleeting moments of connection. Yet beneath the surface, something deeper stirred. For Emily, Ethan represented vitality, a stark contrast to the stagnant life she endured with Jacob. For Ethan, Emily was the forbidden fruit of a world he longed to taste but was taught to avoid. Neither of them realized it yet, but their paths were on a collision course, one that would shatter the fragile balance of their lives and ripple through the quiet fields of Lancaster in ways they could never imagine. The piece of their world was about to unravel. The first few exchanges between Emily and Ethan were innocent, almost cautious. At the start, their conversations felt like polite pleasantries between neighbors. Emily, standing by her garden with a trowel in hand, would ask Ethan about the weather or the state of the crops as he worked nearby. Ethan, shy and respectful, would offer brief replies, often with his eyes cast downward. But each passing day seemed to stretch the invisible thread connecting them, pulling them closer, tightening the bond they didn't yet realize was forming. Emily couldn't deny the lightness she felt in Ethan's presence. There was an energy about him, a vibrancy she hadn't felt in years. He was curious, attentive, and unburdened by the cynicism that seemed to cling to Jacob like a second skin. To Ethan, Emily was more than just a neighbor. She was a glimpse into a world beyond the rigid boundaries of his Amish upbringing, a world full of possibilities he'd only dared to dream about. It was late June when their dynamic began to shift. One particularly humid afternoon, Emily lingered near the fence that separated her property from the miller's fields. Ethan was hauling hay, his shirt damp with sweat, the sun highlighting his youthful features. She waved him over, offering a glass of iced tea. He hesitated at first. Crossing the fence felt like stepping into another world, one his community discouraged him from exploring. But her smile was warm, inviting, and he found himself unable to refuse. They sat on the porch steps, the silence between them interrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Emily broke the stillness, asking him about his life on the farm, his family, and the customs of the Amish. Ethan answered thoughtfully, his words tinged with a quiet longing for something he couldn't quite articulate. In turn, Emily spoke of her own life, her childhood in a bustling city, her dreams of a love-filled marriage, and the reality of her days spent waiting for Jacob to return from the road. She was careful not to say too much, but the loneliness in her voice was unmistakable. Their conversation soon became a routine. Ethan would find excuses to walk the edge of her property, hoping to catch sight of her in the garden. Emily, in turn, began timing her outdoor chores to align with his appearances. What started as casual chats grew deeper with time. They shared thoughts, fears, and dreams they hadn't dared voice to anyone else. Ethan told Emily about the strict rules of his upbringing, the sermons that emphasized obedience and humility, and the unspoken pressure to remain within the confines of his community. Emily confided her frustrations with her marriage, her feelings of invisibility, and the yearning for something more. As their connection deepened, Emily found herself craving Ethan's presence. She sought him out not just for conversation but for the way he made her feel alive, seen, and valued. Ethan, too, was captivated. Emily wasn't just an older woman, she was a window to a life he had never known. She told him stories of places she'd visited, books she'd read, and music she loved. Ethan drank it all in, his curiosity growing with every word. But with every secret meeting, the boundaries between them blurred further. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they found themselves walking together along a wooded path near the Welsh Mountain Preserve. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the hum of crickets. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices soft against the backdrop of nature. When Emily's hand brushed against Ethan's, neither of them pulled away. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through both of them, an unspoken acknowledgement of what was growing between them. Emily knew she was treading dangerous waters. She had no illusions about the consequences if anyone discovered their connection. But she couldn't bring herself to stop. Ethan, despite his upbringing, felt the pull of something he couldn't name but couldn't resist. Their relationship remained a secret, hidden in the shadows of the trees and the fading light of twilight. But secrets, as Emily and Ethan would soon learn, have a way of surfacing. Each stolen moment brought them closer to a line that, once crossed, could never be undone. They were building something fragile, something forbidden, and the weight of it was growing heavier with every whispered word and lingering glance. What had started as innocent companionship had morphed into something far more dangerous, a bond that neither of them could deny, yet both knew could destroy everything they held dear. And as the summer days grew longer, so too did the shadow of the consequences looming over them. The evening of June 3, 2022, began like any other, with the gentle hum of the countryside settling into twilight. Emily stood by her kitchen window, watching the shadows stretch across the fields. Her heart raced, knowing Ethan would soon appear along the path that led to the wooded edge of Welsh Mountain. These secret meetings had become her lifeline, a reprieve from the suffocating monotony of her marriage. But tonight felt different, charged with an unease she couldn't shake. Ethan arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon. His silhouette, familiar yet forbidden, stirred something in Emily that was equal parts excitement and dread. They met near the tree-line, their voices hushed as they spoke of things that felt both inconsequential and monumental. Ethan shared his dreams of leaving Lancaster, exploring the world beyond the Amish community. Emily listened intently, offering stories of places she had been and places she still longed to go. They didn't notice the headlights of a truck piercing through the distance, growing closer with every passing second. Jacob Peterson hadn't planned on coming home early. After a grueling 2 weeks on the road, delivering goods across state lines, he yearned for a quiet evening at home. But as he approached their driveway, something felt off. The house was dark, but the faint glow of Emily's lantern near the garden was visible, casting eerie shadows. His stomach churned with unease. He parked the truck and walked toward the tree line, drawn by the faint sound of voices drifting through the still air. When Jacob reached the clearing, the scene before him stopped him cold. There, under the pale light of a rising moon, stood his wife and a young man, Ethan Miller. They were close, too close. Ethan's hand rested lightly on Emily's arm, a touch that spoke volumes. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, a volatile mix of betrayal, fury, and disbelief surging through him. "Emily," he called out, his voice sharp and trembling. Emily spun around, her face pale as the blood drained from it. "Jacob," she stammered, stepping back instinctively. Ethan froze, his eyes wide with fear. He took a step back, but Jacob was already closing the distance between them. "What the hell is going on here?" Jacob demanded, his voice rising with every word. Emily tried to speak, to explain, but the words caught in her throat. Ethan attempted to defuse the situation, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Sir, it's not what it looks like," he began, his voice shaky. But Jacob's anger had reached its boiling point. He lunged toward Ethan, shoving him backward. The younger man stumbled but caught his footing, his instinct to defend himself kicking in. "Stay away from her!" Jacob bellowed, his fists clenched. What started as shouting quickly escalated into a physical altercation. Ethan, though younger and stronger, was hesitant to fight back, knowing it would only worsen the situation. Jacob, on the other hand, was blinded by rage, each strike fueled by the image of his wife and this boy together. Emily screamed for them to stop, but her voice was drowned out by the chaos. Then it happened. In the heat of the moment, Jacob grabbed a large rock from the ground and swung it with all his strength. The dull thud of the impact silenced everything. Ethan crumpled to the ground, his body motionless. Blood pooled beneath his head, seeping into the earth. Jacob stood frozen, the rock slipping from his hand. The realization of what he had done hit him like a freight train. His breathing was ragged, his hands trembling. "Ethan," he whispered, the anger draining from his voice, replaced by horror. Emily fell to her knees beside Ethan, her hands hovering over his body as if afraid to touch him. "Jacob, what have you done?" she choked out, her voice barely audible. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of the moment crushed her. The night grew eerily quiet, save for the rustling of the wind through the trees. The three of them, Jacob, Emily, and the lifeless body of Ethan, were locked in a tableau of devastation. Time seemed to stand still as the gravity of their actions settled over them. Jacob broke the silence first. We have to do something," he muttered, his voice distant, as if coming from somewhere far away. Emily looked up at him, her face a mixture of fear and disbelief. Together, they dragged Ethan's body deeper into the woods, the weight of their guilt pressing down with every step. They hastily covered him with branches and dirt, their hands shaking as they worked. The task was grim, and neither of them spoke a word. As they returned to the house, the enormity of their actions loomed over them like a dark cloud. The Petersons had crossed a line, one they could never step back from. The fields of Lancaster, once a haven of peace, were now tainted by a secret that would forever haunt them. But secrets have a way of coming to light, and this one was no different. The events of that night would set off a chain reaction, unraveling the fragile lives they had tried so hard to hold together. The tragedy had only just begun. The morning of June 4, 2022, dawned with an unsettling quiet over the Miller farm. Normally, the fields would already be alive with activity, Ethan tending to the animals or hauling equipment to the fields. But that day, his absence was impossible to ignore. Matthew Miller, the family patriarch, had assumed Ethan had gone to a neighboring farm for an early chore. Yet as the hours ticked by and Ethan didn't return, unease began to creep in. By noon, concern turned to alarm. Matthew organized a search party, enlisting the help of other Amish families and even a few neighbors from the nearby town. The fields, barns, and surrounding roads were combed thoroughly, but there was no trace of Ethan. The tension in the Miller household was palpable. Martha Miller, Ethan's mother, clutched her prayer book, her hands trembling as she whispered desperate pleas for her son's safety. It was Matthew who decided to expand the search into the nearby woods of Welsh Mountain. The preserve, with its dense trees and hidden trails, was both a playground and a sanctuary for Ethan during his rare moments of solitude. Matthew rode his buggy to the edge of the woods, his heart heavy with a sinking feeling. As he stepped into the shade of the trees, he noticed the disturbed earth and broken branches. A thin trail of dark stains led deeper into the forest. What he found would haunt him forever. In a shallow grave hastily covered with branches and dirt lay the lifeless body of Ethan Miller. His face, pale and still, was marked with bruises, and blood stained the ground beneath him. Matthew fell to his knees, a guttural cry escaping his lips. The sight of his eldest son, gone so young, so violently, was too much to bear. The authorities were called immediately. By 6 p.m., the once tranquil woods were swarming with police officers and investigators. The crime scene was a stark contrast to the serenity of the surrounding farmland. Yellow tape cordoned off the area, and the sound of camera shutters punctuated the otherwise heavy silence. Detectives Andrew Collins and Sarah Reed, both seasoned in homicide investigations, quickly took charge. The evidence spoke volumes. The ground around the grave showed signs of a struggle, and blood splatter on the nearby foliage indicated a violent confrontation. Investigators found footprints leading away from the site, partially obscured by the Petersons' property line. The grave itself, though hastily made, was too deliberate to be an accident. This was no misstep or freak accident, it was murder. The Amish community was thrown into turmoil. Violence of this nature was unheard of in their world, a stark contradiction to their values of peace and forgiveness. Rumors spread quickly, whispered in hushed tones between families. Who could have done this to Ethan? And why? The police wasted no time questioning everyone who might have had contact with Ethan in the days leading up to his death. It wasn't long before Emily Peterson's name came up. Neighbors had seen her speaking with Ethan near her garden and along the fields, more often than could be considered casual. Some even noted the way she lingered when Ethan was nearby, her demeanor softer, almost flirtatious. To the outside world, it seemed innocent enough. But to the detectives, it was a thread worth pulling. Emily was brought in for questioning 2 days later. Sitting in the stark, fluorescent-lit interrogation room, she appeared calm, almost too composed. Detective Collins leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he asked, "Mrs. Peterson, how well did you know Ethan Miller?" Emily hesitated for only a moment before replying, "We were neighbors. He helped me with some gardening advice now and then. That's all." "And where were you the night of June 3rd? Detective Reed pressed, her tone sharper. "I was home," Emily replied, her voice steady. "My husband was out of town, and I spent the evening reading." The detectives weren't convinced. Emily's alibi was flimsy at best, and when asked why no one could corroborate her story, she simply shrugged. But it was the subtle cracks in her calm exterior, the flicker of her eyes, the tightening of her jaw, that betrayed her. Meanwhile, Jacob Peterson returned home to find himself under growing suspicion. His truck, parked near the woods that night, had been noticed by a neighbor. When questioned, Jacob claimed he had gone for a late-night drive to clear his head. His explanation was plausible enough, but the detectives couldn't ignore the tension between him and Emily during questioning. The couple avoided eye contact, their answers inconsistent and riddled with half-truths. Then came the breakthrough. Forensic analysis revealed traces of Ethan's blood on Jacob's boots and a faint smear on the hem of Emily's gardening apron. A search of their home unearthed another damning piece of evidence, a series of text messages between Emily and Ethan. Though the messages were sparse, they painted a picture of a relationship far deeper than mere neighborly interactions. One in particular stood out, sent by Ethan just hours before his death: "I'll meet you by the woods. We need to talk." The web of lies began to unravel. The detectives now had two prime suspects, but the question remained: who had struck the fatal blow, and why? The tension between Emily and Jacob grew unbearable as each tried to shield themselves while casting doubt on the other. Emily claimed Jacob had acted out of rage, while Jacob accused Emily of manipulating both him and Ethan into a confrontation. As the investigation intensified, the full scope of the tragedy began to emerge. What had started as a secret bond between two lonely souls had spiraled into a deadly collision of jealousy, betrayal, and desperation. And though the authorities were piecing together the evidence, the ultimate truth remained shrouded in shadow, waiting to be unearthed. The courtroom was tense, the air heavy with the weight of tragedy and betrayal. By the time Emily Peterson and Jacob Peterson stood trial in October 2022, the community of Lancaster had already been divided. Some whispered that Jacob was the sole villain, his rage leading to a fatal outburst. Others speculated that Emily had orchestrated the entire series of events, her manipulation driving two men to ruin. Both scenarios painted a picture of a family shattered beyond repair, with Ethan Miller's death at the center of it all. The prosecution presented a damning case against Jacob. His fingerprints were found on the rock used to strike Ethan, and his own confession to the police confirmed his role in the fatal act. "I didn't mean to kill him," Jacob had said, his voice breaking during his initial confession. "I was angry, but I didn't want this." But Jacob's defense attorney argued that his actions were not premeditated, insisting that he acted in a moment of blind fury after discovering his wife and Ethan in what appeared to be an intimate embrace. The defense painted him as a man betrayed, his emotions hijacked by an unforgivable act of infidelity. Emily's role, however, was far more complex and far murkier. The series of text messages recovered between her and Ethan painted a story of a forbidden relationship, one that had been carefully concealed until the night of the tragedy. The prosecution argued that Emily's actions had directly led to Ethan's death. She had lured him into a confrontation with Jacob, fully aware of her husband's volatile temper. One text, sent earlier that evening, was particularly damning: "We need to talk. It can't go on like this." The prosecution suggested that Emily had used Ethan's affection for her as a weapon, setting the stage for the altercation. They charged her with conspiracy and accessory to murder, asserting that her actions and inactions had contributed significantly to the events that unfolded. On the stand, Emily maintained her innocence. She described her relationship with Ethan as a harmless friendship and denied any intention of provoking Jacob's violence. "I didn't know he would come home that night," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want anyone to get hurt." But the evidence against her was overwhelming. Witnesses described her lingering conversations with Ethan, her growing distance from Jacob, and her increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. The defense struggled to counter the image of Emily as a manipulative figure, one who had played a dangerous game with the emotions of two men. As the trial progressed, the tension between Jacob and Emily became palpable. Their shared guilt fractured under the weight of self-preservation. Jacob, though remorseful for his actions, accused Emily of pushing him to the brink. "She knew how angry I'd be," he told the jury. "She let it happen." Emily, in turn, painted Jacob as a violent man prone to outbursts, suggesting that she had been a victim of his temper long before Ethan entered the picture. "I was afraid of him," she claimed. "That's why I couldn't stop him." The jury deliberated for days, their decision complicated by the layers of guilt shared between the two. When the verdict was finally read in December 2022, the courtroom was silent, save for the sound of the judge's voice. Jacob was found guilty of manslaughter. The jury believed his actions were not premeditated but born of a moment of uncontrollable rage. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. His face remained stoic as the sentence was delivered, though his hands trembled as he was led away. Emily, however, was found guilty of conspiracy and involuntary manslaughter. The jury determined that while she had not directly caused Ethan's death, her actions had set the stage for the tragedy. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 6 years. As the verdict was announced, Emily collapsed into her chair, her sobs echoing through the courtroom. For the Miller family, the verdict brought little solace. Matthew Miller sat in the back of the courtroom, his face etched with grief. The loss of his son could not be undone by years served in prison. His wife, Martha, refused to attend the trial, unable to face the people responsible for Ethan's death. The Amish community, known for its values of forgiveness, struggled to reconcile their beliefs with the pain of such a devastating loss. As Emily and Jacob were escorted from the courtroom, their paths diverged for the first time in over a decade. They exchanged one last look, neither of anger nor forgiveness, but of shared regret for the choices that had brought them to this moment. Their lives, once intertwined by love and now bound by tragedy, would never cross again. The fields of Lancaster, once peaceful and serene, became a silent witness to the consequences of secrets and betrayal. The Miller family buried Ethan beneath a sprawling oak tree on their farm, a simple headstone marking the life of a boy who had dreamed of a world he would never see. For the Amish community, the events left scars deeper than any plow could cut into the earth. The tragedy forced them to confront the fragility of their isolation, the intrusion of the outside world, and the devastating consequences of human frailty. And for those who knew the story, one question lingered: who bore the greater guilt, Jacob, who acted in rage, or Emily, whose choices set the tragedy in motion? It was a question that would never truly be answered, leaving the legacy of Ethan Miller's death as a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lie beneath even the quietest lives. The tragedy of Ethan Miller's death and the unraveling of the Petersons' lives serves as a chilling reminder of the consequences of secrecy, betrayal, and unchecked emotions. Beneath the surface of a peaceful community in Lancaster lay human desires and vulnerabilities capable of causing irrevocable harm. The events that unfolded were not just about one tragic night, they were the culmination of choices, neglect, and suppressed emotions that festered over time, exploding in a way no one could have foreseen. At its heart, this story exposes the fragility of human connections. Emily and Jacob's marriage, once built on love and dreams, had deteriorated into a hollow facade. Their inability to communicate, to confront their unhappiness openly, created a void that neither of them could fill. Jacob's absence due to his demanding job and Emily's growing resentment and loneliness set the stage for her to seek solace in the attention of another. What began as harmless companionship between Emily and Ethan evolved into a forbidden relationship, spiraling into destruction. Ethan's story, too, is one of yearning, a young man caught between the expectations of his Amish upbringing and the allure of the unknown. His curiosity about the world beyond his community was natural, but it was also dangerous. Drawn to Emily's stories and her promise of something more, Ethan stepped into a world he wasn't prepared for, one that ultimately led to his demise. His innocence and naivety collided with the complexities of adult relationships, making him an unwitting victim in a tragedy that wasn't entirely his own making. The trial and its aftermath left a community fractured. For the Amish, the values of forgiveness and simplicity were challenged by the harsh realities of violence and betrayal. Could they truly forgive those responsible for Ethan's death, or was this a wound too deep to heal? For the Miller family, the pain of losing a son was compounded by the knowledge that the actions of their neighbors, people they had trusted, had led to his end. And for the Petersons, the consequences of their choices would haunt them forever, even as they paid their debts to society. This story also raises questions about responsibility. Was Jacob's violent outburst solely to blame for Ethan's death, or did Emily's choices play an equally significant role? Should Ethan have been more cautious, or was his trust in Emily a reflection of his youthful innocence? The complexities of these questions underscore the difficulty of assigning blame in a situation so deeply entwined with human flaws. The lessons here are profound yet simple. Communication and honesty are essential in any relationship, especially in marriage. Unspoken resentment and unresolved conflicts can fester like wounds, leading to decisions made in desperation rather than clarity. Loneliness, left unchecked, can drive people to seek comfort in dangerous places. And curiosity, while natural, can sometimes lead to paths fraught with risks. For the viewers, this story isn't just a tale of a single tragedy but a mirror reflecting broader truths about life, love, and loss. It compels us to question how we handle our own relationships, how we cope with our unhappiness, and how far we're willing to go to chase what we feel is missing. What do you think was the turning point in this story? Could Ethan's death have been avoided if someone had made a different choice? Do you believe Emily's actions were deliberate, or was she another victim of circumstance? Who do you think bears the greater guilt, Jacob or Emily? How does this story make you reflect on the importance of communication and trust in relationships? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if it resonated with you. We want to hear from you. What lessons do you take away from this tragic story?